Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Library.Supports. I think this is now our fourth real-time session, and they just keep getting better every time. So if you are enjoying these, please check out our previous discussions. The archives are online with Eric Borkenstein and Matt Finch and Jason Broughton, talking about everything from scenario planning and future forecasting, which is important, to talking about emergency management plans, to talking about building creative spaces and communities. It's been a wonderful discussion. And today I am thrilled to be joined by another wonderful expert in the area of universal design and accessibility. One of the great pleasures of moving down to the University of South Carolina about 3.5, going on 4 years, was I became a colleague with the fabulous Clayton Copeland. Dr. Copeland has a background not only in the areas of school librarianship, but also in information access, information design, and increasingly a very important area of universal design and making sure that services in libraries and elsewhere are accessible. She's done some really fascinating work with, for example, working with our medical school on using GPS to identify different problem spots on campuses and things and getting around, and some of that work is incredible. She is a fabulous teacher, always gets top marks, but what's amazing is that not only does she do a great job teaching, but she gets a great job energizing and getting action and impact from her students. Many a student has not only told me about how much they enjoyed the class, but then shared pamphlet about their new universal design activity, the idea of creating services within a library. She's had a great influence on the state of South Carolina, particularly through the state library, in creating consulting services and really pushing universal access concepts to the most rural settings. And so she truly exemplifies the University of South Carolina's School of Library and Information Science, Knowledge School, and Impact, that we're out improving communities, not just studying them or talking about them. So good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you so much for the high honor and privilege of being here. I'm so excited to be with you, Dr. Lankus, and also with everyone who is in the session, and look forward to our conversation together.
So one of the things, once again, when we talked about putting this up, you were the first in line saying, I'm there, let's do it, let's talk about this stuff. And the thing that I think came to my mind instantly, and yours as well, was that unfortunately, I think I put this up on Facebook, I'm getting very tired of living in historic times. I mean, between 9/11 and economic downturns and such, these are big impacts that are having global impacts. But in particular, in 2015, the city of Columbia and surrounding areas experienced what they call a 1,000-year flood. A huge rainstorm inundated the area. A lot of dams and earthen dams broke, which led to a series of cascade failures, including along the river into the water treatment plant, flooding major parts of the city, closing the university for several weeks. It sort of as a, I don't want to say it, well, it's a mini tryout of where we are now, of moving things virtually and having to do that. The university at the time said we should study this. We should not only, we're a scholarly group, let's figure out what we can learn from this circumstance, which many were trying to put into place now. And the school, including Dr. Copeland, was very responsive to that and did a whole series of studies about libraries in the times of disasters. Talking about, for example, in the United States, our Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, when they came to provide relief and services, set up in libraries. They used library facilities not only because they were safe, but they were in communities with branches. They were trusted areas. People were already coming there for relief and charging and the whole sorts of things. And the story that stuck with me, and I hope I'm getting this right, correct me if I'm not, but you told the story about how as the floodwaters rose, they would send out boats to go and get people out of houses and get people out of dangerous situations with rising floodwaters. Lovely rescue boat pulls up to a house, and that house happens to have a gentleman in a vital and important, not just wheelchair, but really a mechanical support system for mobility, and was it ventilators? I mean, it was a whole series of supports necessary.
Yes.
Couldn't get him on the boat.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so the idea of, in these times, considering not just how we can, it's not just about daily making life better, it is about truly life and death, particularly in these situations. And I can imagine the same situation here, which is, as people particularly that may have, and I speak 100% from my own experience as someone who has pre-existing conditions, where it's going to be important to get people to hospitals and get people medical care, and if we don't have the facilities to take them, if we don't have the transportation to get them there, then we're truly not serving our whole community. So that's, I don't need to raise, I think everyone here is already aware of the importance of this topic, but I just wanted to put that out and to say, let's talk about universal design. Let's talk about not just obviously what we're doing today, but what happens when we get back. The line that keeps coming to my mind is we keep talking within the school about wanting our work and our students to change the world, and then the world went and changed on us. And so using this to make sure that once we do reopen our facilities, once we do get people back in, that we're ready. And so part of being ready is to make sure we serve the whole community. So Dr. Copeland, that was a really long way of, you said you were long-winded, I win. But I hope that, is that where we're headed? I mean, when we're talking about universal design, I know it's not just for people differently abled and who needing different types of facilities, but talk to me a little bit about your definition of universal design.
So universal design, I came to be involved with this a number of years ago. My passion initially was for accessibility, and like many folks who are initially being introduced to a topic, I thought of accessibility as something for someone who has a disability, or to use my preferred terminology, for folks who are differently able, believing that there is an ability that is innate in every living being, and that it is very often through our societies that we prescribe value, and that we assign value, and it's within our power to determine what is considered a disability and what is considered an ability. We have the power to construct and to deconstruct ability and disability respectively. The thing that's important about universal design is that this truly is, to put it in the words of one of our MLIS alums, Caitlin Scott, it's about everyone, everywhere, every time. I grew up in a very rural community, the daughter of a veterinarian and the granddaughter of a farmer. I also was born 3 months premature, and as a result of that premature birth, I have vision in one eye uncorrected, and I use a walker for ambulatory purposes. And grew up with a philosophy from my mother that everyone has challenges and everyone has, quote, disabilities, as it were. But some of those are visible and others are not. So none of us is exempt from having challenges and barriers in life. What I love about universal design is the power that we have to deconstruct disability and to construct ability for everyone, regardless of social or other designation.
Yeah, it's so. My father always taught me to shut up and listen to people and know what they're talking about. So I believe you've brought us some slides and some materials. You're also, just for those who are listening now or watching archives, will be providing, I assume, those slides, but also resources and pointers. So we're going to make sure that that is up on the librarian support website as well. But I'm just going to ask you to take it away, if that's all right.
Perfect. And I ask for folks to jump in with questions and contributions. I am privileged to have studied this topic for a number of years, but I want to learn from each of you, and I know that that is going to happen. So let's please join the conversation together. Let me just get the slides going here. Okay. Equity of access and accessibility, universal design's role. And you'll see that we at the University of South Carolina's School of Library and Information Science have established our laboratory for leadership in equity and diversity. And we are working to have LEAD with 2 L's be a clearinghouse of resources relating to various facets of equity of access and accessibility. But in today's conversation, I'll talk about how universal design is such a part of our communities. And today's communities are defined by diversities. They are a milieu of cultures, ethnicities, races, languages, socioeconomics, religions, or lack thereof, education, identities, whether those are sexual or gender or otherwise, and abilities. I'm sure that you can think of other diversities that are part of our communities. Just to give some context here, according to the latest U.S. Census, about 1 in 5 Americans is labeled as having a disability, is differently able. Now, recent data from the Center for Disease Control, out just within the last couple of months, asserts that this is actually higher, that 1 in 4 individuals is designated as being differently able. The number of children and young people ages 5 to 15 who are differently able is somewhere around 2.6 million. Some challenges are physically visible, but others are not. And much of this is determined by perception. So as we talk about perception for a moment, I'm going to ask you to look at each of the upcoming slides very carefully with the question, which child does not have a disability? I love her little pink tutu and that big, big smile. Okay, so going back to our images, which child does not have a disability?
I'm going to guess none.
Absolutely, we do not know because some challenges are visible and others are not. It's interesting that in some recent research that I conducted, I asked on the survey, first question, do you have a disability? Yes or no? And then a subsequent question. Do you have one or more of the following characteristics? And those included blindness or visual impairment, corrected vision, so the need to use glasses or contact lenses, deafness or hearing impairment, hearing loss, a head or brain injury, mental illness, including something as common as depression, mobility or orthopedic impairments or arthritis, speech or communication impairments, neurological impairments, cognitive impairments, learning disabilities, or to use the newer terminology, learning difference, which I think speaks strongly to the power of construction and deconstruction, post-traumatic stress disorder, although the most recent version of the diagnostic manual from the American Psychological Association has replaced the term post-traumatic stress disorder with post-traumatic stress or other. Now, in the survey that I recently conducted, folks would answer, no, I don't have a disability, and then contact me, oh gosh, I need to change my answer, because when I got to the subsequent question, I realized that I do have one or more of these characteristics. And so much of how we label, whether it is ourselves or others, relates to social values. Inaccessibility places unnecessary barriers in environments. It doesn't allow for flexibility or alternative methods for accomplishing tasks. And it also perpetuates the myth of disability. I know that there are challenges, all relating to finances, disabling environments, overcoming societal prejudices and stereotypes. The power of universal design is in saying this is not for a set number in our population. This is not only for the 1 in 4 who has a disability. This makes an impact. This has positive impact for every single patron who uses our library services, whether they are in the physical or virtual environment. We have lots of solutions for accessibility as well. And learning how our differences make us specially able. Perhaps it is through some of our challenges that our abilities are born. My mom loves to tell the story of my being 2 years old and going to Sunday school, and my teacher meeting my mom at the door after Sunday school was over and saying, oh my gosh, Jan, we don't know what to think of Clayton. And I guess because I also happened to be a little bit like Peter Rabbit in Mr. McGregor's garden at times, my mom said, oh my gosh, what did she do? What happened? And Mrs. Glenn, my Sunday school teacher, said, well, most of the children in here are saying ball. And Clayton was sitting on the floor today and said, Mrs. Glenn, could you please help me get my ball? I can't reach it and I would like to play with it now. And so thinking back to that time, realizing that I had not yet been given my first walker and so needed a little bit more physical assistance with some tasks, seeing though that because I needed certain help and had certain limitations. Other abilities had been born. Not sure if it's a blessing or a curse, but my verbal skills developed very quickly and have kept going. So why should we have to wait, though, or feel stuck? Now, in this animation, the kid is pulling chewing gum out of his hair. We can take action today by building awareness, adopting a philosophy of inclusion, again, focusing on ability and ability born through differences, and being proactive rather than reactive, being on the cutting edge. Part of taking action today in universal access and design can be something as simple as language, the importance of putting the person first. So, for example, rather than saying the disabled child or the handicapped child, saying instead the child who uses a walker. And so thinking about that psychologically, just how does that turn of phrase change our thinking?
You know, it's interesting. First of all, I love this because I get to learn a lot, and I hate this because now I have to rewrite a chapter in a book I'm working on. But um, the language is really interesting, and I just, the idea of thinking of disability, putting that in air quotes, as socially constructed, what strikes me is, right, we don't think about glasses, we don't think about hearing aids, you know, those are normal, quote unquote, and yet they really they have this whole discussion behind it. I was talking with a researcher who worked in audiology, so in hearing, and she was talking about hearing aids, and she said one thing that we know in hearing aids is that when, you know, hearing loss, certain types of hearing loss occur when cells are damaged in the ear, and if we just shifted the frequency of sounds coming in to a higher or lower register, we could improve hearing. But that distorts the sound, so suddenly everything would sound deeper or sound higher, and yet you'd be able to hear it, but it would, quote unquote, distort the sound. And she goes, and within the hearing aid industry, we don't want to distort the sound. That is sort of the thing that we're told not to do. And so in some ways, the social definition of the solution to be what normal is holding back the potential solution, which is, once again, shifting. She goes, in eyeglasses, we don't talk about that. In eyeglasses, you distort light, how it comes in, and things get a little bit bowed or bigger or smaller, and that's okay. And so I just, and I'm sorry, this is a larger conversation, the question you asked, but it keeps that language back to the idea of normal. What is normal? What is not normal? And the minute you put that to a scratch test, it just falls apart.
Well, and I think, David, that you've raised a very important point speaking to social constructions, right? And in society, what is deemed as a disability and what is not. In the cases of contact lenses and glasses, you know, does everyone who uses one of those devices automatically also have the label of being disabled? Well, no, because that need has been appropriately met and accommodated. What I love about that more than anything is that that also speaks to how any challenge can be overcome and deconstructed as a disability, because we have the power to provide appropriate accommodations. You know, we could say that a building, a person is not disabled, but solely by the need to use a mobility device, for example, but by the inaccessible building that doesn't provide for universal design or an accommodation to access the building appropriately with those devices.
And I love it. All right, so sorry, I didn't mean to take us off track.
No, it's such an important conversation. And I think, too, this speaks to our next point of the importance of avoiding assumptions. And when we do have assumptions, questioning those assumptions in ourselves. Well, is that truth? Or is that our constructed truth? Is there something that we could be doing differently that would facilitate ability? In terms of education, what we're doing today, what I love seeing about this group of folks is that every single one of us cares about this topic. We're here because we want to be a part of effecting positive change. And so things that we can do right off the bat, changing our language, it is all really about attitude. Questioning those assumptions, ensuring that we take advantage of these opportunities for pre-service education, but also on-the-job training. And something we can all do at home while we're social distancing, reviewing our policies and procedures. What in them is inclusive? What needs to change? And how can we make that change? Some other opportunities for us right now: exploring funding possibilities, being information brokers, making connections, offering safe havens. You know, we are not in this alone. One of the things about current challenges that we are seeing is the resiliency around the world and people coming together. And in our communities, we have the ability as information brokers to make connections and to bring organizations and groups and people together. So thinking about in our communities other groups who are serving a designated population, whether that be people who are labeled as having disabilities or other groups, and thinking about how we can all collaboratively affect change. We do not all have to do this alone. In fact, our greatest strength is in finding people and groups and organizations to come together. The flood research from several years ago, collaborative efforts across multiple universities, and within the University of South Carolina, the School of Library and Information Science, the State Library, the School of Medicine, all came together for a single research project. We came together with disability advocacy organizations across the state and nation, such that everyone's expertise was brought to the table. And so this also speaks to adopting a team approach, both formally and informally, and creating, for example, inclusive advisory boards in our libraries. You know, do we have folks who represent multiple interests and needs and abilities on our boards? Have we sought and created truly inclusive partnerships? Have we thought outside of the box with skills and abilities that people can bring to the table? Creative solutions and using what we have. I'm also going to talk a little bit more about assistive and adaptive technologies, things that we already have at our fingertips, even in our operating systems on our computers, that will help us to facilitate equity of access for multiple populations. And then talking a little bit more also about universal design, which very simply defined means making small changes to benefit everyone. Universal design ensures that any culture, age, size, weight, race, gender, ability, and I'm sure we could fill in other diversities there as well, can experience an environment that promotes their health, safety, and welfare both today and in the future. Now, why universal design, and what is our argument as we go to funding boards, etc.? Well, universal design ensures social concepts of safety and security. Economically, this can be cost efficient over time. So again, saying this helps every single person who is using the physical or the virtual environment. And then environmentally, this is resource efficient. In terms of universal design for learning, well, right now we are all moving our programs and our services to virtual environments. And in that process, thinking about our programs and services and what we can do to navigate the virtual environment in a way that is not only accessible, but that we also ensure the usability of that space by everyone. As we know, the definition of accessibility is different depending upon the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law and what is intended. So thinking about universal design for learning, we can apply this to any setting where we have the opportunity to interact with others and to engage in shared learning. I've been teaching in an online environment for a number of years, and universal design for learning means having multiple means of representation. So our what? Multiple means of action and expression, our how, and multiple means of engagement. And in the next few slides, I'm going to go through some examples of what each of these encompasses. So for example, in an online environment, multiple means of representation might mean offering a variety of different delivery methods. So in terms of our materials, we might provide a webinar, we might provide an audio recording, but alongside that, we would provide resources and tools to reinforce concepts. For example, we would have documents and files to follow along with those audio components. One thing to keep in mind with that also is that whether someone has a disability or not, every single person has a different learning style. And some of you may be familiar, for example, with Howard Gardner's concepts of multiple intelligences. Some of us are visual learners, some of us are auditory learners, etc., etc. So thinking about how we can deliver content in a way that is accessible to everyone. It doesn't necessarily mean in universal design that every single thing we do is going to be accessible to everyone. It means that the compilation of things that we are doing create accessibility. Some things that we might consider also with multiple means of representation, in addition to providing audio, providing a transcription of that audio, or captioning videos. You know, captioning was first recognized as an accommodation for folks with hearing impairments or deafness, but captioning videos can help so many other populations. For example, differing learning styles and someone who needs to reinforce content by being able to see it and read it. Captioning videos can also be very helpful for the language learning process, someone who is learning a second language. Captioning videos is also very helpful and useful for literacy skill development. Multiple means of representation might also mean effectively using color. So, for example, avoiding highlighter colors that don't have sufficient contrast for readability, or in the case of color blindness, being mindful of color selections, particularly avoiding, for example, red and green. Incorporating digital materials that elaborate upon concepts and provide multiple means of accessing the same content. In terms of multiple means of action and expression, providing a variety of evaluation methods. So, for example, providing opportunities for verbal communication as well as written. In our discussion board contributions, for example, that students must give, in my courses, people have the opportunity to provide an audio recording, to provide a presentation that they have prepared, or to share a traditional narrative format, paragraph style contribution. So, offering participants options for completing tasks. So, for example, a few years ago, I attended Story Fest in South Carolina, and we had a simple craft activity for 3 to 5-year-olds. And I loved that in this activity where the children were putting together their craft, some of them had the option of cutting out their own pieces for their craft, but we also had some pre-cut pieces available for the children to just be able to pick up and use if they had not yet mastered cutting skills or simply preferred not to do so. But part of universal design is providing multiple options such that special accommodations do not have to be requested. They are simply available. And in terms of multiple means of engagement, thinking of ways to stimulate interest, motivation, and persistence, varying activities, and constructing communities of learners. So in terms of technical accessibility, just a few things to go over in terms of universal access and design. One thing that we can do in the virtual environment immediately is to provide accessible documents. And there's several different ways to do this. One of the most important ways is providing for accessibility and readability. Now, for users who are sighted, using sans serif text formats, so for example, Arial, Verdana, Calibri, is very important. The absence of serifs make those fonts much easier to read. Generally, on a handout that we provide, font size should be a minimum of 12-point font. Now, if we're providing for visual impairments on a handout, that minimum font automatically goes to size 18. Obviously, avoiding writing whole sentences in capital letters because that can be misconstrued as shouting. But also using bold to display emphasis. So again, that allows us to have an alternative to using color to display emphasis. If we use color alone to display emphasis, that may be missed by some users or inaccessible to some users. And creating accessible documents. Now, one thing that I was not aware of for many years is how the structural integrity, the coding of documents must exist such that the document is accessible to or readable by assistive and adaptive technologies, such as a screen reader, which is a device that will actually read aloud to a user what is being displayed on the screen. What we know is that creating accessible documents is not all about using accessible fonts and color selections, but in changing the structural integrity, the code of the document, such that the screen reader knows in what order to read the document. So using headers and subheaders throughout the document, such that the screen reader knows what order to read materials. That also goes toward things like creating accessible spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. Just an illustration of some font considerations. You can see here the various fonts. And so we have some serif fonts as well as some Comic Sans fonts, which also can pose challenges for readability. So online accessibility strategies also, properly labeling links, so including our abbreviation for a link or a name for a link, but then also right beside that link providing the full URL, such that if our link is broken, the user can still access the information. Again, not using color alone to convey messages. Logically ordering our PowerPoint objects. Again, in what order do we want the content to be understood or conveyed to the end user? And setting videos to automatically start in PowerPoint, such that someone is not having to search for that access information. Illustrate the point of color selection. This actually was the color selection in a presentation that I recently attended.
Oh my.
So thinking about how we can create readability and usability for all of our users. Generally speaking, what we need is either a very, very light background with a very dark text, the number one accessible format being white text with, white background with black text. Or for some visual challenges, we may need to invert that and have black background with white text, for example. I do have also some options for us for captioning and transcribing techniques for all of our webinars and resources that we may be providing online. So we might create a script first, but we also have some dictation apps that can be very useful. You know, we all use assistive and adaptive technologies daily, whether we think about it or not, whether that's a television remote control or if we're using speech to text on our devices. So I have for you here some different captioning and transcribing techniques and just a few resources that I have used successfully And in the handout that you'll be receiving as a follow-up, I have links to all of these resources as well. Right now, particularly in the crisis that we're all in, many organizations that normally provide assistive and adaptive technologies are providing free access and downloads for home use. So things to keep in mind with that. In terms of creating our own online content, some technologies that we might consider for recording would be Screencast-O-Matic, Camtasia Studio, Vimeo, and even YouTube. The one caution with auto captioning that I would say is to go back in and edit. It does not like my southern accent. That's all I have to say about that. Okay, we also have tools immediately at our disposal, and we need to look into our operating systems for those tools and resources. Speaking about document accessibility, we have built-in accessibility checkers in our software now, both in Microsoft and Mac operating systems. The thing to say is that these accessibility checkers don't necessarily capture everything that needs to be corrected in a document, but they give us a heck of a lot better starting point for document accessibility. And what I like about these accessibility checkers is you can create a document, format it for accessibility, run the accessibility checker, and the accessibility checker is going to give you not only a list of identified problems or barriers in the document, but it's going to give an explanation as to why something is a barrier or a challenge, and then step-by-step instructions for resolving the identified issue. So, assistive technologies. According to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004, so that this gives you the K through 12, kindergarten through grade 12 perspective, is any item, piece of equipment, or product system, whether acquired commercially off the shelf, modified or customized, that is used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of children with disabilities. The term does not include a medical device that is surgically implanted or the replacement of such a device. So, for example, there, cochlear implants would not be considered an assistive technology because it is surgically implanted. But with assistive and adaptive technologies, we have categories. Occupational therapists assign 14 of these. 8 are most applicable to libraries and or classrooms. So aids for daily living, aids for communication or computer access, hearing, education, recreation and leisure, seating and positioning, or vision. Something as simple as a pencil grip or a cushion for positioning is considered an assistive technology. And I have some examples here of things that we can use and share with our communities for adapting materials. Some of these examples are just page turners. Now, I want to say here that one thing we want to always consider is the context in which the items will be used, and we always need to consider the individual abilities and limitations of the user, and can keep in mind safety as well. So something that might be perfectly safe and useful for a child with limited dexterity in their hands to use could become a weapon in the hands of a typically developing child who does not have limitations for their dexterity. So for example, if a child with limited dexterity is using a wand to turn the pages, that necessarily would not be taken and accidentally used to smack something else.
Accidentally, right.
Yes. So keeping in mind those contexts, and I see that I have been very verbose, and we have about 10 minutes. So David, I'm going to defer to you. These next slides are self-explanatory with some different alternative keyboard options that can be used, as well as other page turners. But also want to leave some time if you or other folks have questions.
So let's throw that out. So once again, if folks have questions at this point, in the lower right hand of your screen, you will see a pink, purple tab. And if you click on that, you'll be brought up to a discussion group, the chat box. So we're monitoring the chat box. So if you have questions as we're going, please type them in. And with that, let's just see. And once again, these slides, the resources, they should be up by the end of the day, so we'll make sure that those are available. So one of the things that I always took about universal design was the idea that it's not just about helping people with different abilities, but it is the idea that it is universally helpful. And the classic example that I always hear is at least in the United States here, the sidewalks where they have ramps that go down from the sidewalk to street level so that you don't have to go over a curb or get stuck in a curb. And that in fact, that worked so well that unfortunately people with visual disabilities were suddenly finding themselves on the street. And so they had to add things like bumpy textures and different things to let people know they're going different ways. Once again, the value of that wasn't just to people with visual disabilities or with some mobility disabilities, but parents with strollers and people who are pulling luggage back and forth on wheels, etc. Are we truly talking about? There are always going to be compromises, right? There's always going to be, as you point out, limits in the amount of money we have to spend on potential solutions, limits to what services we can offer to one group versus another group, whether that's about accommodation or, once again, whether that's about socioeconomic status or all these other things. Can you give me a little sense of if you were to walk into a library, because I know you've done some of this where you really consulted specifically on the ground. Give us a sense of the process, the thinking process that needs to go into place, taking us from where our physical library is today to where it needs to be.
Well, I think that one of the main reasons that I've joined this profession and that when I talk with folks who've joined this profession, we've joined this profession out of a desire to help, to contribute, to make important differences in our communities. And so when we are assessing our environments, physical and virtual, I think it's very important to consider multiple perspectives at any given point and thinking about how we would feel in a given situation as much as possible. One of the things that I remember most from thinking about this is that we won't necessarily always remember, for example, what it is exactly that someone said to us or what it was exactly about an environment that wasn't accessible. But we will remember how it made us feel. And so thinking from that standpoint, when we go into an environment and we are evaluating it, how can we make it most user-friendly and most usable by the largest number of people? Is there something that we can do that would make a difference not only for one designated group, but for everyone? As we've talked about today, some of the changes that we would make in the built environment, such as a ramp or a curb cut, help not only those with mobility limitations, but also our senior citizen population and young families and caregivers using strollers and career professionals pulling their book bags and things like that. So thinking about how we can make a space most accessible for everybody.
Yeah, back to the unfortunate theme of a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Mm-hmm. And I was talking with a librarian the other day where, you know, the staff is now at home. Librarians, library staffs, everyone's at home. And how it has been this amazing, sudden exposure to all the things, all the assumptions they made about accessibility. Particularly around their online services. And so staff suddenly were at home, and they then realized how many people didn't have connectivity at home. So all right, so now how do we get internet access to our staff? And then it was, well, they don't even have devices at home. And so, you know, they were talking about how they ordered 100 Chromebooks instantaneously so they could suddenly send them to staff, and they were putting them in prearranged taxis to send them for home delivery, and they had to print out materials to make it available. And what it became was suddenly the staff that was working inside the system was put outside of the system, and their awareness just shot through the roof. It's like, oh, I never thought about whether people could have access or not. And once again, in digital sense, but then again, they're also now encountering staff with needing hearing accommodation, needing visual accommodation. How is this text put in a way that's easily comprehensible? How are the chunks, things of that nature? And so I'm thinking, you know, now is an interesting time to do an audit before we even go back into the physical building of what our virtual presence looks like.
Absolutely. And there are some tools and resources that I've provided for folks that will allow you, for example, to look at principles of web accessibility in the virtual environment and to perform those very assessments of the documents that you have online, of your websites, of your virtual presence. And I think it is so important to realize that we have sown a seed today. And again, as the daughter of a veterinarian and the granddaughter of a farmer, I had the privilege growing up of seeing what it takes to plant a seed and watch it germinate and grow. What I think is important for us to think about, and as we move forward, is to always be on alert, not only in these heightened times for barriers, but putting ourselves very intentionally in new circumstances and situations such that we uncover barriers and can then correct them. Librarians and information professionals are some of the most caring, compassionate people that I know. And I know that when we are aware of something that needs to change, we strive and work to change it. But our greatest challenge is creating opportunities for ourselves to look at barriers and to put ourselves in situations where we see things from a different perspective.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that I've certainly learned in our working together is when we look at things like advisory boards, when we look at board of trustees, when we look at sort of all these groups for governance, for input, for support, there is a rightful and important discussion about the importance of diversity in that. And yet, in some settings, and once again, we have folks in here from the EU, we have folks in the US, we know we have people who are going to be watching from Asia, but particularly in the US, that diversity almost always gets compressed down to a very important topic of race, that idea that we need racial diversity in there. And yet, if we don't have a broader sense of diversity, once again, diversity in the physical nature of what we do, in cognitive nature of what we do, in sort of all of these different things, then we're not truly getting a diverse view of our community. I'm thinking that of several library branches that have opened up with sensory rooms, specifically because they were working with people on the autism spectrum and talking about preparing video tours of the facility ahead of time, because that allowed children with different learning sorry, what was my new, it's not learning disabilities, what's my new phrase? I think this is important.
Learning difference. Learning difference.
That they need sort of to be prepared for the environment, because when they walk in, they're not automatically overwhelmed. They have a sort of map and experience of familiarity before they walk in. And once again, that's only going to come from people who live that life every day. Dr. Copeland, I have learned so much, and I continue to learn so much from you. And I thank you for taking the time. Once again, we will ensure that these slides, these materials, these pointers are up. We will also be able to draft her back in if necessary. So please, as questions come up, this isn't the stopping point. We can, I know Clayton is always open to conversation, always open to working and improving folks, and it's just an amazing resource. So I tell folks, please take advantage of that resource where you can. Any last words?
Thank you. It has been a privilege to be with all of you today, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. So please reach out at any point. My contact information is all over these slides, as well as the resources that you will be receiving this afternoon, and I welcome having your contributions and additions to things that we've begun a conversation around today.
Thank you, and thank you all. Everyone, please stay safe and wash your hands. And we'll see you again next Tuesday for our next conversation. We'll be putting all that information out on the medias, the Twitters and the Facebooks and all, etc. So anyway, thanks again.